So welcome everyone to our third Ujima Governance Peer Learning Sesh. And we're gonna be having Corey Thomas, our chairman, the chairman and CEO of Rapid 7, to share more of his experience with us today. But before we sort of jump to that, just give you guys a little agenda or insight into how we're going to use our time today. So just quick timeline update on sort of where we're going from here. We've been having these monthly sessions. Where's the future lie? What we're hoping to hit. Corey will sort of share his knowledge with us. We'll have a Q&A session for folks to ask questions. So if things stand out, please write them down, save them. We're going to get into it later. And then we'll sort of close off with just sort of our next steps where we see things headed. And yeah, offer space if you guys have any thoughts on what you like us to, what do you like to see too? I think that would also be valuable. So yeah. And so to give you guys an insight on our timeline. So as you know, we're in November. Last month we had Ruby and Amari Jeffries come through, offer awesome presentation. Prior to that, we had Lisa Owens. And where we're going right now is next month, we're not going to have a session. We figure with the holidays happening, it'll be really tricky for us to like coordinate time to have to plan a learning session. And we also wanted to give space to just look at what we've learned, maybe analyze or reflect a bit more. Sort of, we're thinking it's a good midpoint in this learning in some ways. And so we're thinking that's maybe how we might use our time. From there, in January, we're hoping to invite Mariama and another guest. Mariama, who's also part of this collective, has a lot of experience with boards, haven't been on them, I haven't supported them, and has a lot of perspective on that. So we're hoping to invite her. And then another person. So do like a dual situation like we did in October. And then from there, we're hoping to then move forward with our collective design efforts with our members. And so, yeah, that is sort of the timeline. And yeah, if things change in any way, we'll be sure to let y'all know. Cool. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and read uh, a quick bio about Corey. So Corey is the CEO of Rapid 7, as well as chairman of its board of directors. In 2018, he was elected to the Cyber Threat Alliance Board of Directors and the Massachusetts Cybersecurity Strategy Council. He also serves as the Board of Directors for LPL Financial, as well as Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts, sitting on his audit and healthcare quality and affordability committees. He previously served on the U.S. Commerce Department's Digital Economy Board of Advisors. Corey has extensive experience leading technology companies to the next stage of growth and innovation. Prior to joining Rapid 7, Corey was the VP of Marketing at Parallels, Inc., a visualization technology company. Group project manager of the Microsoft Server and Tools Division, steering product planning for Microsoft's data platform, and a consultant at Deloitte Consulting. Corey received the BE in electrical engineering and computer science from Vanderbilt University, an MBA from Harvard Business School. So welcome, Corey, to our space, our community. We're really excited to hear from you, learn from you, and convene with you. So do you need any, I think I made you a co-host. Do you need any?
Yeah, and unfortunately, I don't have a presentation because I could not get approval to use someone else's stuff. I'm also on the New England board of the National Association of Corporate Directors, which has good content. I'm trying to get permission to share some of it with you all, but I need their consent to actually do it. And my standard board deck, I'm waiting. My one of my professors, James Cash, who is just a wonderful man and gentleman. But he did a project for me when I first became chair of Rapid 7. But again, I don't have permission to share it. So I apologize for you all. I actually thought I was going to. So I'll talk through the topics today, and hopefully I'll be able to send you stuff around later. But I have not gotten the consents to share other people's materials because So the first thing I'll say is I am not an expert in board. Let me just provide a little bit of background. I am not an expert in board governance, although I clearly spent lots of time on boards, both chair of my own board at my company. You've got the public boards, but also there's a bunch of nonprofit boards that I actually also, I have been on the board of the Home for Little Wanderers during a difficult and challenging period. I'll share, I'm happy to share that, but not on a recording. I have been on the board of WBUR, where I led one of its committees. And so I've spent lots of time on boards. Part of the reason I think the background is actually interested is I'm interested in actually how do you actually build long-term organizations for success. And I have a bias towards long-term. And so my views are not always mainstream about people that actually do boards and boards governance. So you should just be aware. And most people that are on boards would not consider me the necessarily the ideal of sort of like what great governance looks like, because I tend to be very focused on impact and sort of how do you build and how do you actually create. And sometimes governance can actually feel a little bit weighted towards risk management. And I'm comfortable with the risk, but I'm more interested in impact and change. And so that's sort of where my bias is. So I'll say that to say there's not, by the way, I actually think the way governance is set up tends to be quite constructive, and I'll show you the corporate, I'll share with you much of the corporate model and my interpretation of it. But I also don't want to pretend to be something that I'm not. And so, so just keep that in mind as you go back. There's many right ways to do it, and I come in with a set of biases. And I would say that many corporate boards are too focused on the short term, too focused on the stock price, and not focused on long-term sustainable impact. And so that's just the bias that you should be aware of as we actually start the conversation. I'll also, because we're, I appreciate questions throughout. So like if there's something I say that don't make sense, please don't hold it towards the end. Just say it's a small group, it's intimate. And so we'll share. And also if you have perspectives about the private company boards that I've been on, because I've been through, I'm also on the board of trust at Vanderbilt, which is my alma mater. And so that's another board that I'm on. I'm happy to share questions there, but I'll keep, you requested a view about corporate boards. I'm going to keep it on corporate boards. But if you want to say, how does that apply to the to nonprofit boards, I'm more than happy to actually spend some time and share some perspectives about that. So I would say, the first and foremost thing that I would say that's important is that corporate boards in the US specifically are, their primary job is still representatives of shareholders. And they have explicit fiduciary duties around that. I think that's important because while there's a great argument and bent towards stakeholder capitalism, that is not the governance structure that we live on. And it's also not the legal structure we live on. So you should also be aware of. I get to spend some time with some very enlightened people. I've been impressed with some people that I've been on corporate board with about how progressive they are in thinking about like, how do you actually build a great community and how you sustain? But we actually have legal structures that do sort of like limit how far they can actually go. And it's actually, you're seeing some healthy tensions that actually play out. So I want to start by saying that. I would say that I start off thinking about boards and corporate boards as sort of like two big levels. So anytime I hire a new director, there's sort of like two discussions I sort of have. Is there's the fiduciary job, which is like, what's your legal job? And I'll talk about that. So like, what's the legal job of boards? And then that's the advisory job, which is, I think, the most important job. And I tell everyone up front, like, you have to do your fiduciary job because that's the law. You have a legal requirement to do your fiduciary job. But your advisory job and how you work with the management and operating team and sort of like guide, steer, challenge, ask questions, engage, that's where all the value creation happens. And I think a very well-run board is, and a very well-run management team, and so I'll talk about the overlay between the board and the management team, is very efficient at the fiduciary job, and they're so good at the systems and processes and candor in the discussion that the fiduciary stuff is done extraordinarily well, which it has to be done extraordinarily well, but in 20% of the time. And the advisory piece that's really about how do you actually navigate the impact takes 80% of the time. Now, there's a lot of prerequisites there, but I just want to start by saying that, like, just think about that. The legal job, I think when it's done well, takes 20% of the time. and the advisory strategic job takes 80% of the time. And that's my view, and other people have a different view, and I'll share that bias. But that's what I consider a very, very well run. So what's the fiduciary job of the board? First and foremost, you gotta actually make sure the integrity. And that starts in many cases with both the financials and regulations and laws. And so that means that basically you have to actually make sure that your financial statements are accurate, they're true, they're audited, they're filed, they're on time. You have to make sure that all laws are, there's enough infrastructure within management. So you're actually, your job as a board is to actually question, quiz, but oversee management to make sure that compliance and regulatory regimes are in place and adequate to actually do the job. And then your last job outside of the fiduciary, outside of the financial, regulatory, and compliance is to actually make sure there's a good leadership team in place and they're being good stewards of the business. The board does not manage the business, but the board's job is to actually make sure that there's a good leadership team in place. And primarily they do that engagement with the CEO. And so, if you're going to be extreme about it, you say like the boards outside of their financial and regulatory and legal responsibilities, their responsibility is to assess the CEO and hire and fire the CEO, which is why you see so many boards have, not so many, but a number of boards have antagonistic relationships with their CEOs because there's a power dynamic that's at play. I had this very same dynamic on a board where I was on a church board that I was actually on. And I say that is that it's worth contemplating that dynamic between, that power dynamic between the board and the CEO can either be constructive or can negatively impact the culture of the organization. I believe that great boards and great CEOs actually have an open, trusting dynamic. And that doesn't mean it's not challenging, but it's actually candid and it's not actually based on fear and a dynamic of fear. And so, again, to summarize the fiduciary, hire and fire the CEO, certify and ascertain the financials, and ensure that all laws and regulatories that are applicable will be applied to. That's bread and butter of the fiduciary stuff. The secondary stuff, which is the advice, which is so valuable, really comes down to advice around the team. So yes, the board can hire and fire the CEO, but they should be providing valuable advice and perspective around the team. They should be providing, co-creating and approving with management the strategy that the company undergoes. And then they should actually be bringing outside perspectives into the management team to actually help them understand what's happening in the broader board. You can think about these as sounding, listening stations that are saying, I'm hearing this, I'm seeing this. Are you seeing it? What are you actually thinking about it? Are you responding to it? And that's the big part of, I think, the strategic goal of any board. So let me pause there, and then I'm going to jump into a bunch of tactical stuff. But I think that, one of the big things is just sort of what is the role of a corporate board and how do you actually think about it? On the advice and consent, I would say that most boards engage with the management team, for example, on diversity, on the advice and consent sort of like agenda. Boards don't have, so a healthy board does not have it. Now, a board can actually pass resolutions that actually mandate things to management. I would say that when a board is actually mandating things through resolutions, you know that there's a company that's about to fall apart very quickly. And so if you think about something like the increase in diversity and inclusion discussions that are actually been going on, many of those have happened under the advice section. So the way that happens in a well-run board is, listen, this is happening all around us. We actually owe it to ourselves to actually make sure that we actually have a great program in place and we understand what happens and we're clear about the goals. Come back and in the next board meeting, share the perspective about like, how are you thinking about it? Where are you today and what the goals are? That's would be a constructive board discussion in there, and then providing feedback about sort of things that are, so I sat on a board and the management team came back and the feedback was, that's not aspirational enough. That's not audacious enough. But that is the dynamic. I think sometimes with corporate boards, there is a misunderstanding what the well-functioning corporate board is, and it's not a say-do thing. That is a dysfunctional corporate board where the board is actually making decisions by fiat and resolution. So let me just, because I want to spend time on the roles and responsibilities, because if you get that wrong, then there's so much damage is done. So I just want to, let me pause and see if there's questions there, and then I'll go to a whole bunch of tactical stuff about how boards work. But are there questions about the roles and responsibilities?
Well, not so much about roles and responsibilities. I think that you gave a very clear overview about that. Thank you so much. But I do have a question around access to the board. Like, how do, because part of the question for Ujima as well is like, who should be on the board? How, what should be the process to put someone on the board, and what does that look like in the corporate world? Is there, you know, a process that everyone uses, or is like best practices? How do you make sure that you have construct a healthy board?
Yep. So let's just jump into that. And so I'm going to skip topics around just to hit that one directly. So how do you actually figure out your board composition is what we tend to call it. It's sort of like, how do we actually think about the board structure and the board composition? So there's a couple of things that I would actually point out. The first thing is that most boards have a set of standing committees. So there's some things that are done as part of the board as a whole, and there's some things that are actually done as part of committees. So at Rapid7, we have a compensation committee that deals really not just with compensation, but they deal with compensation and people strategy issues and HR issues. So in this committee, we actually talk about, we approve the compensation. That's a legal job. They have to actually approve. In fact, their only legal job is they have to approve my compensation and the CFO's compensation. And there's requirements around that. But we also go to compensation strategy for the overall organization. Is where do we want to pay versus on benchmarks of where everyone else is paid. We also go over succession planning. If they fire me, like who's going to replace me? Or if I get hit by a bus, who's going to replace me? And then we also go over diversity and inclusion. And then we also go over employee issues like retention, attrition, you know, are we losing people? We have an audit committee that deals with all the financial stuff I talked about earlier. We have a nomination and governance committee whose sole responsibility is to decide the bylaws by which the rules by which the board operates and the company operates. So how decisions get made, governance there, and to actually nominate people to the board of directors. Those are the three standing committees, and the nomination and governance committees do that. So let me just talk about what the nomination. We also have an operating committee that's not a committee, but it's people that we need to pay more because we get their advice so frequently. And so they're like, you know, most board responsibilities are, you know, the boards I'm on, I spend, call it 18 days a year doing the work, sort of on average. But these are people that we're using like 30 or 40 days a year. And so we have a separate structure and compensation model around that. So let's talk about what a non-gov committee, because it's going to go there. So the governance, you know, is pretty straightforward. It's sort of like, what are the rules of which the company makes its big decisions? So there's a whole bunch of rules, like how many votes do you need to actually do this? What are the rules for buying a business? So there's a whole bunch of stuff that's actually there, but those are just the rules. So they form the rules by which the board operates. The second thing that they do in the nominating committee is that they actually work with the board to create profiles of where different people's experiences and expectancies are on the board today, and what skills, experiences, perspectives, connections will be valuable to the board. So what they engage the board in a facilitated discussion on is say like, all right, where are we today? Where do we want to go? And what skills, experiences, and perspectives do people bring to the table today? And what are gaps that we actually have in actually how we actually get there? So what you'll typically find is that there's a board profile, and you profile every existing member of the board. And then you also say, what's our ideal mix that we actually need to get to where we want to go? And what that roadmap then allows people to do is figure out what the next set of ads should be. But also it then says, all right, how quickly do we need to actually change the existing composition on the board? So like, how do you think about the policies about like who leaves the board at any actually given in time? And there's a whole set of strategies that nomination and governance committees do to actually figure out who leads the board. but the simplest one is they do term limits. So, at Vanderbilt, my alma mater, they just did a big update of the board, but we actually have term limits that says you serve 5-year terms, and that actually provides an opportunity to actually bring someone out, and you're capped at 2 5-year terms. But that's the role of the Nomination and Government Committee, in conjunction with the board chair. So the board chair facilitates a process about like, where do we want to be, along with the managing director, the CEO, the executive director. But then the Nomination and Governance Committee then says, all right, how does that translate to what we want to add to the board? Now, this is where you see a big, deviation, frankly, in the nonprofit world versus the corporate world. In the corporate world, it is primarily about skills, experiences, and pedigree. They don't want to use the word pedigree, but it's a lot about pedigree that's actually there. So like, who brings stature, to the board, or what are we signaling, and some other stuff. In fact, now you'll find this is where I am not completely aligned with that, is that, half of our board is first-time directors who actually were very successful but have very limited pedigree. Because I actually thought that I value the advice and consent agenda more than anything. Is I want people that actually care and are going to challenge me and actually ask hard questions. But again, there's lots of focus on pedigree, but you won't see that as much if you actually look at our board. The nonprofit world is a little bit more complex, so I'll just only mention it because you do have to, many nonprofits have to have a focus about like, who's going to donate and raise a lot of money. And there's just no way to actually get away from that. I have an interesting friend who I won't name, who started a nonprofit, and I donated some money, and we were going through strategy. I'm just like, your board is all people. She's like, I don't want any people that are just about fundraising on my board. I want people that care about the mission. And I really hope that it's going to be successful. We'll see. Because at the end of the day, I would say that for lots of nonprofits, funding actually matters. And we can have a discussion later, but that can all cause all types of tensions there. That's a special dynamic that most corporate boards don't have, that dynamic. They have other dynamics, but not that particular dynamic there. So it's worth calling out that separation. So then once you actually decide the profile, you typically interview a slate. You either hire a search firm, or you actually send it out and you say, listen, I'm looking for people with this set of skills, this set of experiences. So for example, if you need someone that's going to sit on the audit committee, it's like someone who's been a CFO of a tech company. So we need someone that, and then you're interviewing for skills, and then you're also interviewing for fit. Now, fit is a very tricky thing because that can often be used to discriminate against people. And I still use the word fit because people do it. So I just prefer to be explicit about it instead of having it implicit, and like, it's sort of like you're still discriminating, but you're just not talking about it. And so what does it really mean? It's that it needs to actually, you're looking for people that will work with the board culture. So for example, is that when I'm looking for someone that fits, it's 2 attributes. I want someone who's curious, who is candid, who's willing to actually disagree with me and other people, and who's respectful. And you have to have all 3 of those. I'm not looking for someone who is opinionated and thinks they know the way the world works. And then, because if they're not curious, that means they can't be listening. They're not part of the conversation. I want someone that's candid, but they have to be respectful, because I don't need anyone that's actually creating a culture in the room that actually just makes people feel bad. That's not incredibly useful or insightful. But at the same time, if they're respectful and curious, but they're not willing to challenge me or disagree with me when they have a different perspective, that's not valuable either. Because look, I tell the directors, I said, your job is, I'm getting ready to do something stupid. Your job is to tell me it's stupid before the rest of the world tells me it's stupid. Don't embarrass me by not, like, you should make me feel bad, so I don't have the whole world making me feel bad by judging me. And so, like, that's part of their role, is to say, hey, Corey, I know you're passionate about this, but like, it doesn't make any sense. Let's talk about it. Let me understand your perspective, because I'm completely missing it. That's happened to be what I look at when I'm looking at fit. Everyone has their own thing, but there is an element that every board is looking at and say, like, all right, what are the experiences we want to have on the board, and how do we actually want to engage with one another, and how do we actually want to have conflict? And I've been on many dysfunctional boards, and I've left, a couple boards that were dysfunctional, because I'm just like, this is just not for me. It's not interesting. So that's the, so you got the skills, you're looking for the fit. You either you hire someone to do the search, or you actually go out and network and do your own search. And I've done a mix of both of those things. So did that answer your question? I just wanted to see if we covered it.
I have an add-on to that question. Could you also talk about the process for electing board members to public companies? You're on the LPL board?
Well, Rapid 7's a public company.
Rapid 7 is. Oh, okay.
My
so the shareholders don't vote on what process do the shareholders have?
So shareholders vote on the directors. They just don't get a say in which directors they get to vote on. And depending on your rules, you don't even need 50% of the votes. This goes to the whole governance section. And I would say investors have actually started pushing back on sort of like these things that sort of like create, I would say, not control. But the way that it goes is that the nomination and governance committees, and this, by the way, everyone has their own governance rules. So I'm just giving you a generic playbook here, but it works broadly with some tweaks. Nomination and governance committee votes someone on the votes to nominate someone for the board. The board then sort of like can do one or two things. They can actually either put them on the slate of directors that actually goes to the full shareholders, or sometimes they can actually give them temporary appointments to the board. Most boards require a vote of the shareholders. Now, the rules about how that actually plays out is interesting, because some people say that like you have to have a majority. Some people say you have to have a plurality of votes. And for those of you who haven't done vote counting, you get to a plurality that can get very interesting, because that means you can actually have a bunch of people that don't vote, just like you do in an election. And essentially, it's how do you actually count like the voters versus the non-voters versus the no's, the yays, nays, and sort of like people that don't vote at all. But in general, what you actually find is for most corporate boards, most of it is a majority of the shareholders do vote for the directors. Is one thing. And the second thing is most of them are trying to actually get 90+% of the vote. And so that's one of the goals that you actually see in place there. But shareholders do vote at the annual meeting each year. Now, boards vary in their flexibility about whether they can assign someone to be a director before the annual meeting. But at the annual meeting, there's typically some vote. Now, there's rules to get around it, in that, for instance, Rapid 7 does not vote its full slate of directors every year. And I can go over sort of like why some of those things sort of happen. Which lots of governance, this is where I disagree. Lots of good governance firms would say your full slate of directors should be voted every year, because the investors should have a voice, just like the people should have a voice in it. But we only do 1/3 of our directors each year. And the primary reason for that for us is that I have a long-term perspective. Is I'm not interested in being extorted or making it easy for people that are in there to make a quick buck and a quick profit to actually try to actually come in and push for things that are unhealthy for our employees and our customers. And so by actually sort of like staggering it out, it actually gives some leverage for people that, if they want to actually focus on the short term, they have to do it over an extended period of time. And so that's the reason there. But shareholders do vote for at the annual meeting each year. Good question.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, please jump in.
So how important is it, and you can use your example in your current in Rapid 7. So if the board began to operate dysfunctionally, or with the director, like what would you do in your situation in terms of the importance of the culture, right? That you've that I guess attracted the board, and that defines their bylaws to stop the dysfunctionality from getting big, so it tears the organization apart.
Yeah, and so there's a couple things. One, you should have a board chair, and the board chair should be good at navigating complex people issues. And so like that should be a skill set of the board chair. Respectfully, with candor, but you want a board chair that can actually navigate complex people issues. The second thing then is with your executive director and the board chair, the CEO and the board, and I happen to be both for my board, but I said on the boards where I'm not, is you actually want to have some agreements or discussions about what the culture of the board, and basically that's the behavior of the board. What's acceptable versus non-acceptable. The best thing to do is to actually, you get that agreement at a point in time with the people that are there, but then when you add new people, before you add them, you say, listen, these are our norms. This is what we expect. If the norms are violated, here's what actually happens. But you're just upfront about it. It's not a negative. And I have this with people. I said, listen, you will sort of like, our norm is that you'll be candid, but you'll be respectful. We expect to hear your voice. We expect to actually have you engage. And what we do is that when we don't, and I've not had that at periods of time, when you don't have that, you actually tend to give people feedback privately first. That's why you need to have someone that's sort of like exceptional, but willing to have the conversation, willing to say that this wasn't great. And at the same time, if it's actually devolving, this is where you actually, it's good to have someone who's actually good at managing the dynamics, because oftentimes if I find a conversation devolving or unconstructive, like, looks like we need a break, let's actually take a break and let's come back to it. And in that break period, then I'm having some conversations about like, listen, I know you're passionate. Should we actually have a follow-up discussion maybe about how we actually follow up on this so that we can actually leave space for other people to engage? And so, but like you use those breaks, but you need someone who's actually can navigate these tough dynamics. Because listen, so many times, you can say people's passions can get in the way as a constructive. I often find people's egos can get in the way. And so you have to be willing to actually constructively actually manage that and call that out, which is why the most important attribute of your chair is probably someone that everyone respects. Because if you have a chair that people don't respect, then it's really, really tough to actually do the stuff that I'm talking about. Great. And I saw the time check notice. So how much time do we actually have? I'm fine, but like I want to make sure I'm respectful of your times.
Yeah, so we're gonna end at 5. I was thinking maybe we have time for 2 more questions, but I obviously want to give you guys some insight on next steps, but probably up until 4:58.
So let's do 2 more questions.
Cool.
Well,
go ahead.
this may be cheating. Oh, sorry. I was gonna say this may be cheating a little bit, but I know you had some other topics, Corey. I think I heard you say something about tax. So my question is, could you talk about one of those topics?
Yeah, no. And this goes to more about just the board, I would say, organization. One of the things I would really encourage you to do is put a board calendar in place. And a board calendar is really, what are the things you talk about at every, so there's 3 things that you actually want to think about in terms of structure and organization. What are your board materials? What are the materials that you as a team prepare for the board? And you should negotiate that with your board to make sure that they're the right materials. And so I would say that there's a normalizing thing where you say like, here's the materials that we actually need to do our fiduciary job or whatever they want to see. And the trick is it shouldn't be too many, but it needs to be enough. It needs to be sent out a week in advance. People need to have time to review it. And then you need to decide, are you going to present it at the meeting or are they going to come in and ask questions around it? You just got to figure out your rules and your norms. They're like materials, how far in advance do they go? Are you presenting the materials you sent out? Or are you actually sort of like going over it and saying like, all right, what are the questions around it? So that's one thing on the materials. The second thing is you should figure out what's your standing topics and then what's your rotational topics at every board meeting. And so standing topics you cover every meeting, you want that to be very efficient. Lots of the advice and consent and stuff is sort of like rotational topics. But even then you should have a calendar about which topics. So like we're going to talk about like annual finances in this meeting and we're going to drill down. We'll cover it every meeting, but we're going to, instead of 15 minutes to every meeting, in this meeting, we're going to go over an hour because we're going to cover where we are and next year's plan, strategy and partnerships. But you can figure out what the rotational are, but you should ideally have a calendar that says, here's the topics that actually rotate. And then you'll always have room for special topics. It's very mundane, but I wanted to highlight it because it is an attribute of a highly functioning board.
I have a question as well. So you have experience both on corporate and nonprofit board, and you already did a good job kind of calling out some of the differences. Would you be able to share what you think nonprofit boards could benefit from in terms of like things that are done in corporate boards and vice versa? Like what are things that from the nonprofit experience that you think corporate boards could learn from?
Yeah, so I think so it's funny. It's the same exact answer, just in the opposite way. So nonprofit boards are mission oriented. And they're actually about a long-term perspectives. I think one of the failings of corporate America today is the system is exacerbated by two trends. I think sort of like corporations are disconnected from communities. But the other trend is, I think, short-termism, where I think corporations are not focused on like long-term consequences of the corporation itself. And so you want the corporation to be healthy. The nice thing about nonprofit boards is they're mission oriented, and people tend to be tackling difficult things over a long time horizon. So I think that's the advantage there. Now, the disadvantage of nonprofit boards, I think in some ways, is a lack of professionalism because it's so deeply personal. And what I mean by that is that things too easily fall into the realm of personal opinion. And yeah, personal opinion actually matters, but there's not enough quest for sort of like views that may be contrary to sort of like your personal opinion, and sort of like facts that don't validate. And so I think that you could, mission driven can turn into blind fanaticism if you're not careful. And I think it's important to actually have space. And I think corporate boards do a generally good job of this, is that there's plenty of space to actually say, where are our assumptions wrong? What are we actually looking at that's not true? And I think that's one of the challenges. The other thing is nonprofit boards, oddly enough, I think this goes to the whole money dynamic earlier. The leadership and the governance just typically isn't as good. Most executive directors of nonprofit boards are not skilled at managing well-heeled, well-moneyed directors, and the chair role is not chosen based on who's best skilled at actually managing that. And I've seen some fantastic management of that. Paul at WBR has done a fantastic job of actually helping manage through some difficult transitions there. But I would say that that's not always the skill set that's actually valued there. And that's challenging. The other part that's just a natural tension that I'll just call out is that, lots of nonprofit boards have donors on the board. And because of that, there's sort of like a dual responsibility that's hard, is that I have an opinion, but also if I don't like what you're doing, that may impact how much money I give you. And that's just a hard thing to navigate if you're an executive director. So like, I use a public one. I sit on Vanderbilt's, they're fundraising, they got a whole bunch of stuff, but part of it's the fiduciary, but then on this advice and consent, it's kind of messy because they're also asking me to give them a big check. And I'm just like, well, you kind of ignored my last feedback, so I don't know how I feel about writing you that big check right now. And that's just messy, right? And so there's nothing wrong with it, but you should just acknowledge that that's a little bit messy. And I think we're all out of time, but this has been a real pleasure.
Yes, thank you so much. I've been taking notes throughout, and I feel like I personally learned a lot, and I think this will be valuable to what we are trying to accomplish here. So yeah, maybe we can do a virtual round of applause for Corey, maybe some handshakes.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. I mean, I really do commend you for actually, I saw the lineup earlier, and you're actually starting off in that healthy way of actually getting different perspectives that I don't see lots of people doing. So kudos to you. I will jump off since I know you guys getting ready to sort of like talk about some of your own next steps, but thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Corey.
Thank you.
Cool, thanks folks. So we are taking a break in December. It was very great to do this all with you. I think we've learned a lot. Just to note, if you have any feedback on this session or sessions in general, please send them via email to us. And then also, if you have ideas for folks that we should invite to learn with next year, please let us know. And then Nia would like to say something.
Sure, thank you. So I just wanted to say we put out in the staff wire last month, we put out the video from Lisa's session. So I don't know if anyone had a chance to see that. And what we did as a part of that wire was we also created a notes document to try to encourage people, if they're watching the video, to write any notes or questions they have to add to the conversation. When I last looked at our YouTube, had about 30 something views. So I see that we have some people who are watching, so that's great. And then we have, I believe we're slated to have a staff wire coming out next week. So we'll be putting Ruby and Imari's video in there. We want to stage it, so we're try to give people as much opportunity as possible to watch it. So just letting you know that, because you could also kind of send it around to people to get more eyes on it and encourage them to go into that notes doc and to ask questions and write down any feedback that they have.
Thanks, Nia. And thank you all. This has been really, really great. Look forward to email on the next one, but it'll be sometime in January. Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.
Woo.